Hello, greetings. My name is John Blue. In the background is Melanie Green.
Hello.
She just bowed. You can't quite see her. And we are here to chat.
Yeah, so my first question is, who are you? What makes you qualified to answer questions about meditation and Qigong and Tai Chi? Maybe start there.
Good question. Well, I already said my name. I don't know about qualifications. I ended up with a master's degree in traditional Chinese medicine, and I have lived for almost a decade, at a Taoist monastery, studying with a master there. I don't know if that makes anybody particularly qualified. I'm sure that there are people that have been studying and training their whole lives that maybe are not very qualified. But I do like to share and contribute to the community as best that I can. And I think it's fun to answer questions and talk about the little bit that I've learned, and to see if together as a community we can learn more from each other.
And so you're training full-time under a Taoist master, ChiChi, who is part of the Longmen Taoist lineage, if I remember correctly.
Longmen Pai, the Dragon's Gate sect, the lineage.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I am a fervent student. I am a fan.
A big fan.
And Mel, of course, is also a student of Mr. Jerchum. And so...
That's right. So if anyone has questions related to Taoist philosophy, internal cultivation through methods such as meditation, sitting, standing, walking, as well as Qigong and Tai Chi, John is learning all of the above from a Taoist master who is quite renowned in his art.
He is, and he's very camera shy in a lot of ways. You can find him, by the way, it's always good to plug him, at TaoistStudiesInstitute.org. And he teaches almost every day, and he is a wonderful person, Master Jerchum. If you have the chance to study with him, I highly recommend it. But since he is less likely to chat with the community, here I am instead.
So I guess maybe I can start with a question related to the events of the day for anyone who's listening and might relate. So I am in a very bad mood today.
And not a very bad mood.
Not a very, very bad mood, but just like lots of feelings of overwhelm and lots of, like I have this impulse to kind of do everything and fix everything immediately. And, you know, obviously that is not a wise approach because it is exhausting and it's impossible to do everything everywhere all at once. And so on the subject of meditation and trying to be more mindful, more awake generally, especially in times like this where everything feels chaotic and overwhelming, what advice would you have?
Well, I'll pass on Master Jerchung's catchphrase. What's the first thing that you do?
You don't.
You don't. And any action taken in that mind frame, in that emotional frame of frustration, need, and internal pressure is always going to give you an outcome that reflects the seed in which it was planted. And so the very first thing you want to do is release the need for it to be a certain way, because it will never work out. The need for yourself to be a different way, the need for the world to be different than it is. It has to be like this. It has to be like this now at a certain time frame. I have to be able to feel about it a certain way. And then I notice that I'm not feeling about it in a certain way, which makes me more frustrated because I'm spiritual, God damn it, and I need to be feeling blissful all the time. And so all of those cycles feed into this same negative feedback loop, literal negative feedback loop. It's a positive feedback loop of negativity there, where it feeds more into itself.
Yeah.
And that quality, first you have to step off of that particular train, that particular merry-go-round that feeds into itself. You have to sidestep it or maybe step into the center where things are still. And then from that still place, then take action. The first thing you have to do is release. The first thing you have to do is don't. If you don't let go of the cycle of tension, then that tension will end up informing and flavoring all of your actions anyway. And so it won't turn out the way you want it to.
Yeah. So, right. And this is actually my first moment of don'ting, so to speak, like taking a break today. I've kind of been on my laptop doing work since this morning and battling power outages.
When the power went out. That's why it's dark in here right now.
Yeah.
I'm sitting in the sun because we have no power.
Yeah. And so I've been feeling overwhelmed because of the amount of work that I have to do this week and the interruptions, I guess, that we've been experiencing here the last couple of days because of the power outage. And so, yeah, it is really, really helpful to take breaks and breathe, because otherwise I tend to push through it. And that's probably a reflection of my OCD. There's like a momentum to that kind of activity. Like once I start trying to fix things, it just, like, I won't look up until 5 hours later.
That's right.
And then, oh my gosh, now by that point I'm feeling really exhausted and cranky. And so I think that's really good advice. Yeah. And so I guess the next question I would have is so taking breaks, don'ting, remembering not to get too caught up in certain internal cycles of control and attempting to kind of fix everything. And
well, can I say something about that in particular?
Yeah, please.
That we have this discussion commonly in our culture, especially in our work culture, that really prizes this idea of flow, being so deeply immersed in what you're doing that the world fades away.
Yeah.
And so people would describe your deep focus as a kind of flow, and people long for that experience. They long for that lack of distraction. And so in a way, what you are calling a negative, most people would call it positive. I would still call it not a great healthy process, because what you are being immersed in is this externalized process, because it's possible to be sitting in the deep still space. Like what the immersion is, the flow state is actually happening from resting in the deep space of stillness. And in that space, then doing your work. And so you're still resting, but you're perfectly clear and aware. You're not being subsumed by some other thing to the detriment of your body, to the detriment of everything else. Because I'll make food for Mel, for instance, and I'll set it down next to her and she'll see it. And she'll look back at her laptop, and I'll come over again hours later and it's still sitting there untouched, and she has not had any awareness of the outside world. And so then when she does come back to herself, she's starving and thirsty, and her body doesn't feel good, if you don't mind me describing.
No,
And so that quality of being gripped by what you're doing, which is an externalized process, it's a thought process, it's an idea of something. When that takes you away, it's just like a daydream. It's just like anything else. It's sweeping you away from the quality of awareness that is just resting in stillness. It's the opposite of that. And so it's always harmful and exhausting. And it's possible instead to engage in very complicated tasks while resting in that space of stillness, which doesn't consume the same kind of energy. And you're capable of being aware of making adjustments to your body and sipping tea and doing these things that you actually need to continue to feel healthy without sacrificing the quality of your work. But it's the opposite direction. Instead of going further out into the thing, you rest back here and then do your process.
Right. Yeah. And so for me, that means recognizing when I'm starting to feel that momentum, that tension that can happen in the cycle, in like an OCD cycle of trying to accomplish, or this flow cycle that you're describing. So recognizing that earlier and earlier in the process, and just chilling for a minute as a way of kind of detaching from
I think so.
that habitual pattern.
Detaching from that cycle of tension, that whirlpool that pulls you into this other process rather than resting in the still space.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like for anybody that has any kind of tendency toward neurodivergence, ADD, ADHD, autism, which we both enjoy, OCD, all different kinds of layers, including Tourette's and different kinds of ways that the minds can work. We all end up dealing with a different shape of a mind. I'm staring at the microphone as though it's the camera. And that different shape is important to recognize as you find your state of balance and find how to harmonize your particular tendencies. And so for people who tend to, for instance, be drawn strongly into a cycle that is not healthy for them, and I think this can be for all different kinds of people, even people that have this huge cycle, this biphasic manic cycle and then a crash cycle, these things. If you can recognize that process starting, which those of course are extremes, but for any of us, if you notice this swing starting to happen, rather than being in the center, by being attentive to your own life and paying attention to what it feels like to be resting in the center, to be settled, then you will feel the change in your body, in your emotions, when you start to be drawn out of that center point. And so the second that you begin to feel that change, then you should, hopefully, learn what you would need to do in order to draw yourself back. The body is your friend. If you start to feel your heart racing and your shoulders gripping and your jaw tightening, maybe you start to get a headache, or maybe just your emotions begin to race or your mind begins to race around, then that can be an alert system to let you know, oh, I'm starting to head in this specific direction. And then you do what you have to do to find center again, whether it's go for a walk, lay down. What I used to do was to, even in the middle of a conversation, if a conversation was upsetting me, I would, to the great detriment of my friendships at the time, just sit down. I would just sit down in front of the person. I even did this in my clinic from time to time. And I would just cross my arms and I'd close my eyes and I would wait until the mind got quiet, my emotions stabilized, and then I would continue. And this, of course, was a little easier for me because most of my friends are used to me being odd. But it's because I committed to staying awake, resting in that center point. That to me was the most important thing, and everything else was allowed to fall away. And because of that, it became easier and easier to stay centered. But for people that they value something else more, maybe you're at a job and you can't sit down without losing your job, or can't go for a walk if you need to, or you can't take some deep breaths or do some Qigong or something to recenter, then that can be really challenging. And so you kind of have to find a way through. Even in my classes in graduate school studying medicine, that I did standing posture constantly in the back of the room because I was so uncomfortable with my experience of my body and my mind racing, and I was in a room filled with people and it was very difficult for me. And so I talked to all my teachers, and I was lucky enough to have lots and lots of teachers throughout the years that would let me just be in the back of the room, and I would stand up and I would do my Qigong practices and it would help me feel centered and I was able to learn more easily. But there would be teachers, of course, that wouldn't let you do that. And so you're just sort of stuck and not able to do what it is that helps you feel more balanced. And so that's one really great argument to, if you can, get a job working from home, work remotely, or work with people that understand you better and are willing to support you in what you need. And if you are in a triggering situation, something that's triggering your cycle of obsession or fear or whatever that is, and it's making it difficult for you to remain centered, step away from it until you find your center. And if you have to step back into it, go ahead. And until that anchor, that stabilized spot becomes so stable that you can then step back into any situation and remain in the center But in the very beginning, especially as you're learning to do this stuff, that can be really difficult. And so it's easier to step away.
Yeah, and actually that was going to be my next question. So for those who are listening, feel free to add any questions to the chat. John and I are just discussing meditation and basically trying to figure out how to remain grounded in our minds and our bodies when we're in the midst of chaos and overwhelm. And what you mentioned I thought was really helpful, and it kind of prompted the question in my mind, how do we find stillness? Like, we talk about it a lot. Letting go is a phrase, a common phrase, but what does that mean, and how do we know when we're doing it correctly?
Well, I'm still a big believer in exploring these ideas through the body first, because the body seems to be the easiest space to discover them. It's difficult to, for instance, if you're caught in a thought spiral, a thought storm, to just let it go and let your thoughts fade away. It's completely possible, but it can be a really difficult first step. And it's the same with an emotional spiral. If you're feeling depressed or you're starting to really get yourself worked up, especially in the beginning, by the time you've noticed that you're worked up and that you decide to change your mind, I really don't want to be angry at this person. This isn't good for our relationship or my job or something. Then you can usually start to, people will learn to take 10 deep breaths, this kind of thing, maybe go for a walk and slowly calm down and chill their emotions out a bit. But the first and easiest place to find that quality of letting go for me is in the body. And I have a whole video about it. You can check it out. But the quality of letting go of your shoulders or letting go of the tension in your hand is the same quality as letting go of the emotional cycle and letting go of the mind. It's the same process, but it can be difficult to understand in less tangible spaces. And of course, I'm just saying that as a person that's more physically based, maybe for more mental people, it's easier for them to quiet their mind than it is to soften their body. I'm sure there are people who are different. But I tend to err on the side of starting with the body. If you can learn to unclench your musculature, soften your hands, relax your face once it's tensed up, that process, not only is it good for your emotional cycle and quieting your mind, because the body-mind is one flow, it's one system. By softening your body, you find your emotions quieting. You find your mind calming down. And so it's useful in that sense. But that muscle, shall we call it, that capacity to let something go, that's the same capacity that you would use for letting go of a thought. So for instance, if you were meditating and you're sitting here quietly, and the meditation classes, the 100-day meditation series starts tomorrow, by the way, this exact same time if you'd like to join us. And you're sitting there and you're meditating, and you notice after a few minutes that your mind has wandered away. And you notice, oh, I'm thinking about gardening, or I'm thinking about breakfast. And the first thing to do is to let go, to soften around those ideas, to simply allow your mind to notice, your awareness to notice that your mind has wandered away. You become awake inside the dream. I'm having this random fantasy about breakfast. And so first, don't react, just notice. And in that act of noticing and relaxing your mind, it can often feel like you're just disregarding it. You're just deciding, it's not important. It's that fun social media word, meh, M-E-H, meh. It's the sideways thumb. You don't care. Oh, I'm having a thought about breakfast. It's not good. It's not bad. You don't judge it. You just notice that you're having that thought. Wake up. Notice that you're daydreaming. And what will happen as you relax, just in the way that you relax a muscle, is the thought form, the daydream just fades. It just shreds itself. And your mind comes back to the present moment, to what you're doing, which is the meditation. And the more often you do that, of course, like with anything, the easier it gets. Until very soon, the feeling in your body of beginning to daydream, of going away from what you're doing, is uncomfortable. And you will relax it, just in the same way that eventually this feeling of tension in your shoulders is so uncomfortable that you can't hold this. You would just start to relax. As soon as your shoulders started to creep up, it would trigger you letting them go because it's too uncomfortable. Being distracted in that way and caught up in your fantasies is just as uncomfortable. We just don't notice it. And feeling emotional, feeling frustrated, feeling angry, even caught up in kind of manic joy, it's all very uncomfortable in the body. It's just that we tend to not notice it. But as soon as we start to get good at letting that go, then our awareness can kind of trickle down and settle back into the present moment again. And it gets really easy to stay stable and settled.
Yeah. I noticed that there's kind of like this moment, this period of, depending on how strong my internal experience is, say I'm, again, feeling really overwhelmed and compelled to go and do. Letting go in moments like that can feel very, very difficult. And I notice that when I start to let go, the mind becomes very uncomfortable, so to speak. Because the mind will start to say things, my mind will start to say, well, this is really important though.
Uh-huh.
Or you're halfway there, you might as well just push through it, or some form of sunk cost fallacy to try to compel me to keep going. And that period in the beginning of letting go can feel very, very uncomfortable, especially if it's accompanied by really strong emotions like fear or anxiety, or, gosh, all of this feeling will just go away if I can just finish the thing,
That's right.
And so it can feel really tempting in the beginning of that letting go process to grip again, and so I like your analogy of the cup of liquid that contains, filament debris, whatever, and you shake it up, and there's all of this turbid matter kind of floating around chaotically, and the only way to get it to sink is to stop shaking it up, to just set it down. And there does seem to be a point at which you pass that phase of intense discomfort, and then it starts to feel a little more comfortable. I'm noticing right now I feel very different than I did just before we started this Q&A, when I was busy working. All of the things that my mind said were really, really important then feel a little less important
That's
now.
right.
And nothing has changed really, except that I've stopped working. I've don'ted for a little bit.
That's right. Got away from that cycle.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny. It's the mind that tells you how important the mind is. The ego is so pumped up about its own self that it thinks that it's the most important thing in the world. And when you're listening to that, and it's telling you it's the most important thing in the world, and when you're invested in that, it feels like the most important thing in the world. And then you step away from that and you go, oh, it was just smoke. It was just noise for the sake of more noise. I remember the first time, because I grew up mostly without a TV, but there was a time when I watched, I don't even remember now what it was. Maybe it was the X-Files or some show back then, The Simpsons or something, when I was a kid. And then I got old enough to start working. And so I went out and I was playing jazz, and I'd get a job and I'd do these things. And so I couldn't watch shows anymore, right? Because they all happened at night when I'd be out playing and doing these things. And I noticed, I was shocked to notice how little I cared about the show after just a month or something. Somebody that I used to sit in the AOL chat rooms, for those of you who are super old, you know what America Online was. And we had, X-Files discussion rooms, and I had all this lore memorized. I don't remember any of it now, but it was really important to me. It was the center of a few of my friendships. And it was even the password on my computer at the time was some obscure phrase. And then just stepping away from it for a little while, that pressure subsided of my idea around it. And I completely stopped caring about it. I don't think I ever watched it again, even when I did have time. Because something about being caught up in that cycle and that identity process, well, it felt so important that it ran some good portion of my life. But when we step away from it, suddenly we don't care. And it's really common when people come to meditation retreats or they do these long sits or they go hiking for a long time and they're away from technology. At first, they go through a kind of detox phase. They're searching for their phone constantly. They're thinking all the time about what they're missing. But then after a while, a week or 2 weeks of being out, they stop caring. And then when they go back into their life, they feel like everyone around them is crazy because they're all obsessed with this thing the way they used to be. And it's so easy, of course, just to pick it back up again. But it's very important to recognize that often it's just the bubble of feeling, this pressure. And when we start to recognize that pressure, that feeling of I have to do this thing by itself it's a kind of toxic state. It's a kind of uncomfortable thing. It's not comfortable to feel pushed. I need to do this thing. I really want this thing. That by itself is a really strong state of discomfort. It's just that people are so used to that feeling, they don't know any better. And everything in our lives is like that. If we have this sense, I really want to do this thing, I need this thing, this is important to me, that by itself is actually a state of great tension. And so we just don't usually clarify or label it as that because we're not clear about what peace feels like. And so the first thing we do is we try to settle into that peaceful state as best as we can in any context that we can and notice what that feels like. And then as soon as you find yourself wandering away from that sensation, and you have to be willing to check in with yourself, then you go, oh, something's wrong. And you notice, am I keyed up? Am I feeling depressed and sinking below it and kind of lethargic? Some funny mixture of the two. And then you make the adjustments. And that's where Qigong or these meditation methods come in because they're a prescription to help you find how to find the middle again. And I think for people that are easily caught up in those cycles, that's when it's really important to not ask your mind what it wants. What do you want to do? Well, it wants to do whatever it wants to do. But when it's already caught in those cycles, it's always going to tell you, oh, I want to do this thing. I want to watch more X-Files or whatever it is that you're obsessed with at that moment. And then the second you step away from it, you go, oh, that was just this obsessive bubble of hot air. And then it fades away and you're just back to being more yourself. And the more of those, I don't know why I'm calling them bubbles, but they feel like bubbles of just empty noise, of just pressure. And they just fade away and float away. And then suddenly you feel better. And the more often you can let those go, the easier it becomes to just stay in the center. And so having rituals set up that bring you back so that you don't have to ask your mind what it thinks. Instead, you're just practicing because you said you'd practice. Or you're working and you put your work down because you said, your little egg timer goes off. And it says, okay, now it's time to stop working. And you go for a walk until all of that pressure goes away, and then you go back. And that way you don't have to ask your mind if it's time to stop, because you know what it'll say.
Right. Yeah, such good advice. I still need to do that. I have a timer and I haven't been using it.
It's a little reindeer
really
egg timer.
Yeah, it really does make a difference. So you said that it becomes, the more we're able to let go, the more we're able to don't, i.e. pause. When we're in the middle, when we become aware that we're in the middle of tensing the mind, or gripping the emotions in some way, that the more we practice that letting go, the easier it becomes. Is that because in the same way that there's kind of a momentum to tension, to these patterns of trying to control the world around us, there's also a momentum to letting go?
I think there's a way of thinking of that, a kind of inertia. Yeah. That, what does it feel like? It is very much, at least in my body, it feels a lot like waking up from a dream. That you're asleep, and there's that space where you're in that in-between realm where you're kind of still half asleep. If someone talks to you, maybe it gets mixed in with your dream a little bit. It's easy to fall back asleep and then wake back up again. And you don't really want to move because if you move too much, it'll wake you up a little bit too far.
Yeah.
And there's those like layers. I'm sure that a sleep scientist has names for each of those phases of sleep as you come out of it.
That would be really interesting.
Yeah, as a way of talking about it. And then there's a point when you're just awake. And you may not even feel clear-headed yet, but you know you can't go back to sleep. And so you're still groggy. Maybe your body still wants to sleep. All the sleep chemicals are still going. But you've come out to past a certain point. Now it's like, okay, you can't go back to sleep. You might as well get up, move around, something like that. And then as you move around, you're clearer and clearer. And you're no longer trying to hold that place. You're just awake. And it would feel weird to start falling asleep at that point. You're driving and you feel clear-headed and this kind of thing, assuming you've rested well. And you're driving, and pretty soon you start dozing off. It would freak you out. Well, what am I doing? That's not the time for this. And so it's like that. It would feel strange to start falling back into these weird delusions about things. And it's really surprising the more I get to talk to people in this context, or usually in the clinic when people are private and they're willing to tell you what's really going on with them. It is shocking that you find out that these people who otherwise they seem quite okay, and maybe in a conversation with friends, they say, oh yeah, I'm doing fine. And then they come into the clinic and they're willing to tell me their secrets. And very, very often they are barely hanging on emotionally. They're caught constantly in these delusions and these obsessive cycles, these things. And it's unfortunately often rewarded by our culture to be obsessed with work, or this like the flow state that you find yourself in that you have discovered it actually brings you suffering. But from the work perspective, it's wonderful. You get this worker who goes in there and works solidly for 8 hours, doesn't stop to eat or to pee or anything else because I have work.
And you're validated for that behavior, which perpetuates that pattern.
That's right. Yeah, it's the same thing that I got as a martial artist, or that the more of these unhealthy patterns you were willing to engage in, the more props you got from your community, because they're also that kind of person. And so it's one of the reasons to make sure that you spend a lot of time with people who are actually the kind of people that you want to be, who have the qualities of cultivation that you want to develop, which is why I feel so lucky to hang out so often with Master Jirchung, because I'm cultivating these qualities of stability and balance and presence. And it feels strange to be around him, for instance, and to have my mind wandering, to be lost in thoughts or obsessing about something. If I had walked in and I was in a bad mood or something and he looked at me, it would just be very weird to be in this Taoist center and to be sitting there and angry about somebody who cut me off. But I know that there are people that they would do that, and they drive to the bar and they have a beer with their friends, and all they want to do is sit around and talk about how angry they are about the drivers. And so one is reinforcing one behavior, one is reinforcing another. And so you want to make sure that you're surrounding yourself with the behavior that you want to bring out, because you always get more of what you put energy into, including stability and stillness, until you just are awake.
Yeah, community is important. As you were describing the effects of letting go and kind of this attitude that we develop of meh, whatever, when there's this thought that wants our attention, we're just like, brush it off. It reminds me of just brush your shoulders off. It reminds me of like just the general process we go through as humans of maturing. Like when I think back to my early 20s and certainly my teens, and I reflect on the things I thought were really important then, I have this total meh, whatever attitude toward today. What would you say, or is there a difference between waking up, letting go in the sense that you're describing, and maturing as a person? Like, what are the differences between those two things?
It's interesting because that's the kind of language that's often used in classical literature in China and India, and that they call it spiritual maturity.
Oh, interesting.
And we do often talk about kind of growing up. And it is interesting because very often if you are And I think everybody experiences this during those times when they're feeling stable and peaceful. They're just in their world, living their lives. And then you run into somebody who's freaked out because they bought a phone. It was supposed to be green, but it showed up, it was pink. Now what am I going to do? My whole life is ruined. It doesn't match some process like that. Or the show that they really loved is canceled, or there's a scratch on their car or something like that, and they melt down. And in those spaces when we are feeling ourselves balanced, we look at that person and it's okay. It's just a car. It's just a show. It's just your phone. It's not a big deal. But they do seem like children who are throwing a tantrum. And I feel like it's the exact same energy of that 3-year-old. Like, I want it my way. Why isn't the world doing what I need? Why hit the ground or pull a gun? Because our problems, it's the same energy. They just seem bigger to us as adults, and our reactions are 3 times bigger. And if they're billionaires, then they ruin some huge thing in the world. And so that's why we have to be careful not to give people more power than they can handle. And I feel like that is a real thing, that it feels like a lot of the problems that we carry around with us are childish, which is not to say that they are unimportant or that they aren't real, because people will feel, my phone is green or pink, I can't remember which one. They wanted one and they didn't get the other. And they will genuinely feel hurt by it. It genuinely is a terrible experience for them. They're crying, maybe they're hitting the ground or something like that. They're yelling at their dog because someone cut them off in traffic or something. And while we're not involved with that, and we look at that and we say, man, this is really childish behavior, what are you doing? Remember that to them, it's real pain. It really does hurt. It really does feel like the world is ending. So we don't want to look down on it, even in the same way that we wouldn't look down on a 2-year-old who was crying. Something got lost, or an ouchie happened, something happened that scared them, and now they're just not doing well. And they're clenched up and they're screaming, and we may think, oh, come on, it was just a lollipop that fell on the ground or something like that. But to them, it really is the whole world. And it's the exact same thing when we get a 60-year-old who's out there screaming and crying because their soccer team lost a match or something like that. And to us on the outside, it feels childish, but remember, to them, we still want to treat it as though they really are in pain, and to help them alleviate that pain without adding more to their delusion, because it is still a childish delusion. So I think there is something to thinking of it as a kind of maturation. Like, if we decide that adulthood is being clear-headed and calm and able to take care of it, and childhood is being lost easily and not understanding why the world is not treating you well, and not seeing that there's people out there outside of yourself. Someone cuts you off in traffic and screams at you because they're still stuck in a phase in their life where they're like 3-year-olds. They think that you're not a real person. You're just some character in their drama, or you really were driving slow just to make them mad or something like that. And it is a kind of childish behavior, but it's still real. And those people really are worthy of empathy and our care and respect, because clearly those are people that aren't doing well, and they must be in a lot of pain all the time. And so I do think it's worth thinking about it as a kind of growing up that we do. It just has nothing to do with age or the positions of power or how much money we have, because very often those people in power and wealth, they're often clearly still very childish. They just have a lot of power, and you see the effects of that on the world, which is why we do what we do. It's the reason why I put so much energy into trying to add my tiny bit of energy into this realm of the world of trying to help people be grown-ups, where we treat each other better and we see the world a little bit more clearly, and we stop behaving like 3-year-olds having a tantrum.
Right, yeah. And that can be such a challenge depending on the circumstances,
Mm-hmm.
Like, if I'm understanding you correctly, it sounds like we want to acknowledge the pain within ourselves without necessarily reinforcing patterns of behavior that strengthen cycles of pain and harm, whether it's to ourselves or others. And yeah, in those moments, it can be challenging because of that discomfort, I think, that we have to experience along the way, of allowing the pain to be there, or allowing whatever the thoughts are saying to say what they want, without trying to appease them, trying to suppress them, or do something that we think is going to, attenuate them somehow. We just stewing in it.
You just have to be with it.
Is so is it fair to say that we should expect a degree of discomfort along this path?
I think so. Yeah. I think that's actually a really important piece, that at least while we're still suffering, because I was just having a conversation with somebody online. I sent a message to somebody. We were talking about how really fairly early along this spiritual path, if we decide to call it something like that, personal development path, that we can actually become free of suffering. We become free of certain ideas. It's kind of like we grow up and we become an adult, and we stop pretending all the time that it matters what color my phone is, or if my car has a dent, or if somebody calls me the right name or something like that. There's a point in there when you let go of all of that stuff. And during that process of letting go of all of those things, it can hurt every single time. Like, to use that metaphor I was using earlier of this feeling of like a hot bubble of emotion and thought, you just have to wait for that to move until it passes. But during that time, especially if your mind is telling you that it's the most important thing in the world, it can suck. But it's the same thing within your body. To go back into this shoulder example, if I do finally learn to let go of my shoulder, but I have an old shoulder injury here, which is why I learned to hold it up. For a while, this is going to be quite uncomfortable. And my spine may hurt, and my hip may hurt, because now it throws off my walking style. And that whole process has to happen. Maybe this gets inflamed as it finally starts to heal, or whatever that is. We have to learn to step into those uncomfortable places within ourselves, physically, emotionally, mentally, and within our lives, in order to make the changes that are required to heal. And so it's the same thing in our world. If I've spent my life lying to somebody, or to myself and to the people around me, and then I realize, oh no, actually it's this way, and I don't want to lie anymore about this thing, I have to go around and tell the people in my life that I've been lying. And I think a lot of alcoholics have to go through this, because a part of many kinds of drug addictions and alcohol addictions is this tendency to hide how you are. And so one of the steps on the 12-step program is to go around and tell everybody the truth, to pop that bubble of this self-imposed isolation. And usually the people around you have known for a long time, but now you're bringing it out into the open. So that's a kind of healing that can happen. But it definitely sucks, and it's definitely painful. And every time you take one of those steps to heal some part of your life, you usually lose a friend, or you lose a job, or some big change occurs, which is not comfortable. And we have to be willing to step into that process of discomfort in order to heal. It's the same with the shoulder pain. It's the same with healing an emotional injury, that we have to be willing to look at it and step into it and through it in order to heal, which usually incurs a lot of discomfort. And so I think it's really important that people recognize that it's not a very good selling technique. You go to a spiritual retreat and they're like, oh, it's all rainbows and fluffy kittens and bliss. But that is not what life looks like. You have to be willing to see things how they are. And usually the reason we started hallucinating our lives in the first place is because we weren't comfortable with how we are. And so learning to work through all of that stuff, to use Mel's example of the water settling and the mud settling to the bottom of the water. When that water becomes clear in a river, suddenly it's wonderful. Now you have clear water, but now at the bottom you can see all the skeletons and old bicycles and that car tire that somebody threw there 50 years ago. And now you have to do the work of pulling all that old stuff out, which can be uncomfortable and embarrassing. And it's not going to look pretty, and usually your thinly layered veil of spiritual bliss is going to be disrupted and people won't see you the same anymore. But it's a much healthier way to be, I think.
Yeah.
Those are the things I'm thinking about.
I appreciate what you said at the beginning about how we can learn to let go through the body first, and that through methods like Qigong, for example, and that in doing so, we learn the mechanism to release patterns of tension in the mind and in the emotions as well. And in my own experience, I've noticed that old patterns, harmful patterns and habits can dissolve over time through these physical practices alone, without even necessarily having to psychoanalyze whatever those patterns were in the way that we tend to in our culture. And so, yeah, I don't know if you want to say anything about that, but it strikes me as a very elegant way of learning to let go of tension in general, because we don't have to talk about it or think about it. We can just practice letting go in the physical body, and that informs the rest.
Mel's making these very elegant Qigong moves in the background. You can't see her, but it looks really nice. And I am in complete agreement that it's very common. When I first started studying traditional Chinese medicine, I was surprised at how little discussion of psychological trends and this kind of thing that there were. We discuss a lot of orthopedic philosophy and channel healing and how chi flows in the body and what it looks like when the mind does this. If I become attached to an idea, what happens in the body? And these things are very well discussed, but we discussed very little of common psychoanalytic, like psychodynamic concepts. And it's because of this understanding that the body, the emotions, the mind are all one flowing state. It's all one thing. Your mind is in your body is in your mind. It's one thing. And when we go through the pathways of the mind, we tend to make a bit of a mess. We have to dig out, how do you feel about your mother? Is this classic idea, right?
It can be very triggering, right?
It can be very triggering. Yeah, for good reasons. And yet, and you can spend years in therapy, and I am not talking down about therapy. It seems to be very, very helpful for many people. And there are lots of different kinds of therapy. They're not all talk therapy methods, of course. So please don't misunderstand my statement here. This is just another way of seeing healing. There are a lot of ways to heal. And at least for the people in my clinic and in my own life, I found that by going through the body, as I was describing before, how the softening the body, just softening, can have a tremendous impact upon how your emotions function, how your mind is healing. That very often you find at the end of that process that a lot of those issues have resolved themselves. And I found this for all kinds of things, for major phobias that I had. Because at this point in my life now, I find myself no longer suffering. I haven't been unhappy now for many years. And it's wonderful for a lot of reasons. And I really wish this for everybody. And it is, as I was saying earlier, a pretty early step that happens in this meditative healing process, where you no longer live in a space where you can be easily bothered by the things that are happening inside and outside you. And to understand that it's possible to heal things like, for me, one was a major fear of heights that I had. And that change happened through simply sitting quietly in meditation and doing Qigong practice. And then suddenly I was exposed to, in my traditional Japanese carpentry work, very high places in a very precarious setting. And I discovered, this isn't bothering me at all. And it used to be that it would trigger sweats and vertigo and all of those major changes. And suddenly it was gone. And I was really shocked because I never did anything to deal with that. It just went away on its own. And I found that to be true with all kinds of strong psychological problems that I grew up with and emotional issues that I had to deal with. And so I think that if such a thing is possible through simply sitting quietly and learning to soften your body and breathe outside, if those kinds of changes are possible, gentle exercise, eating a better diet, then maybe that's the better route to go than years of very expensive therapy, which may or may not help and may instead complicate things and give you stronger ideas of yourself or to reinforce bad mental habits. Of course, depending on who your therapist is and the method that you go about doing it. And so if therapy is working for you, that's wonderful. And for those of you that find it not helpful, just know that there are other ways through that don't involve that direction. And for me, they have been found to be much more useful, in my opinion.
No, I don't think I have any other questions about that. Just like it was this huge relief, I guess, that I had to realize that Qigong was having that effect on my life, that everything started to feel easier, that work started to feel easier, because so much of what challenged me in the past was just a mental barrier.
That's right.
That I, for whatever reason, wasn't able to let go of. And learning how to soften tension in the body through Qigong has had that same softening effect on those kinds of mental patterns too, without my even knowing it. Like I was sharing with you, through so much of my life, I felt compelled to wear makeup. Anytime I would go out in public, I would put lots of cosmetics on my face. This was for most of my 20s. And just recently I gave a presentation at work and I thought to myself, I really just don't want to go through the process of wearing makeup. Not that I have anything against it. I think it's wonderful. It's fun. It can be if you're into it. But that day I just wasn't feeling it. And so I didn't. And I reflected on it later and I was like, that would have given me so much anxiety, even just like a year ago.
Yeah.
And it wasn't anything I processed through therapy or analyzed on a psychological level. Like, why do I do this? I mean, I've thought about why I do this.
It can be tied into a lot of things.
Right. And that's just one of many examples of old habits, fear-driven habits, specifically in my case, that softened over time because of Qigong. And so I really do think that it's such an incredibly powerful medicine, and I love that you're here teaching it to all of us.
Yeah, I think it's really wonderful. And something like that, and I still feel like you have just been, in general, so brave. Most of you haven't had the chance to chat with Mel yet very much, unless you listen to our podcast or have seen her in other venues in the future. And Mel, by her nature, is a very bold and adventuresome soul and has been healing in so many ways. And this is one of those where she's willing to look directly at her experiences and question them and release things and make changes. And it's really amazing to watch. And something like makeup, it sounds like a small thing, but it's probably intertwined with so many different psycho-emotional, social factors. Like there's social pressures, there's a whole history in there. There's all of the feelings around yourself and others, your job and performance, and all of those things were transformed, not because you worked on them, but because you let go in other capacities. And so that means all of those things in that constellation relaxed somewhat, which is a huge thing to say, because that probably changed 1,000 other things in your life as well. And through simply learning to let go and breathe a little bit and rest, and I just think it's profoundly powerful medicine as well.
Yeah.
That's why we like to share it with you.
That's right. Yeah, what do they say, that our world is a reflection of our inner state? Yeah, I've been able to observe that directly for myself through this practice of letting go in Qigong, and it's so true.
Well, and just for clarification, what we mean by that statement is that the way we experience the world has to do with how we are inside. And so for me, if I get into a car accident, as long as nobody's hurt, I get a fender bender or something like that, it would probably just sort of be a funny experience and a way to bond with whoever I ran into and an opportunity to grow, and it probably wouldn't bother me at all. And for somebody else, it would be a near life-ending amount of anxiety and stress and pressure, even if all the other factors were the same. And so I just say that because what I don't want people to hear is that common magical thinking idea that as long as you are clear on the inside, your world works out for you on the outside. You have no problems. Nothing ever bad happens to you. Because there's a whole lot of people in Ukraine right now that are probably dealing with a lot of issues. A lot of places around the world all the time are dealing with a lot of external problems of famine and disease and war and all these kinds of things going on. And that may have nothing at all to do with their inner state. So I just don't want people to hear that, well, if they were a little bit awake, those things wouldn't happen to them. Because I know that there are people saying that. I think that is a crazy level of bullshit. But even in those terrible experiences on some forced march from one place to the next, there will be some people that are having a terrible time, and there will be some people that are quiet on the inside and peaceful even during those worst moments. And so we want to recognize that it is our experience of our world that is profoundly flexible and transformable through these kinds of methods and practices, because oftentimes that is the piece that we can easily change. Sometimes you're not able to change your exterior circumstances, but you can always influence your internal circumstances. That's what I mean to say. Because I think that kind of statement can be easily misheard.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I was actually having that conversation with a family member the other day, and that's how they heard it.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh no, not quite like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I appreciate that clarification. Yeah. Because I mean, pain is life involves
right.
different levels of pain.
Well, there are in so many cultures, there's that idea of the caste system that if you were born poor, it's because you are of a lower spiritual level or something, or maybe you did a bad thing in a past life or these kinds of things. And if you're born wealthy, it's because you're inherently, supported by whatever God you believe in, or this spiritual cycle is, and so people who are in a good place are inherently better people than people who are in a bad place. And there are entire traditions of culture based around that. The most obvious one that pops in my head, of course, is the caste system of India, the Brahmin system and these things, and the untouchables, people who are just born that are supposed to be inherently lower people, or it happens through economic means or skin color means. It happens all over the world. And I definitely think that is not true. And it's funny how many actually of our spiritual traditions echo one perspective or another, that you get the Buddha who is born as a prince and a king and becomes instead a king of spiritual people, and I much prefer the stories where it's somebody who is nobody. He's just some random person born in the poorest and worst situation and still manages to find themselves through enlightenment or whatever spiritual process, because it shows that it's available to anybody at any time and not something that you have to be born into. I think that's a terrible lesson to give to people.
Absolutely.
Know your place.
Right. Yeah. Well, and there are lots of studies on meritocracy that also reveal that there is no direct correlation between circumstance and success in life. And actually, I think it was a research study by MIT many years ago that revealed the companies, they surveyed a bunch of companies here in the US, company cultures, and it revealed that the companies who claimed to kind of adopt meritocracy as a core value, meaning the harder you work, the more you produce, the more successful you'll be.
Yeah.
This study revealed that actually those were the least meritocratic companies, because they assumed that they kind of took that quote unquote core value to be true without actually creating the circumstances to reward effort or to help people who needed more training or those kinds of things. And so anyway, whole ton of research out there that kind of debunks that myth,
I
which
think
I think
so
is
too.
really fascinating.
I think so too. And maybe this is something that we should have a whole Q&A discussion about meritocracy and Mel's perspectives on, because I think it's quite
I
fascinating.
did. I wrote that paper in grad school years ago.
Let us end it here. Thank you for those of you who joined us momentarily and who followed through in the future listening to this lecture. We will have more Q&As, and hopefully we'll actually have people join us. And I think it's a lot of fun just to get to chat with Mel in the very least. Mel's always wonderful and insightful to speak to. And thank you all for taking the time to watch and join us. I hope that you have a wonderful day. Get out there and enjoy your practice.